Highlight this table is the Center for Disease Control prevalence of adverse childhood experiences across the United States at a nationally representative sample. And what I want to point out is that just about three things. First is that about 36% of the population across the United States has an A score of 0. Turn that around and say that about 2/3 of us have an A score of 1 or higher. So adverse childhood experiences is not rare. It's most of us. Now, again, as I mentioned, the adverse childhood experiences, those 10, restricted to those 10 events. If you have an A score of 0, it doesn't mean that you don't have trauma, because there are other events that can lead to that traumatic experience. So that's one thing. It's not rare. The second thing is that about 13% of the population have an A score of 4 or higher. Okay? About 1 in 8 people have an A score of 4 or higher. The average A score is a 1.61. If you have an A score of 1, you're 89 times or 89% more likely to have an A score of 2 or higher. So if you have 1, you're more likely to have 2, kind of thing. So I'll come back to that in just a few minutes, because I want to talk about some of the work that we're doing with high trauma groups. As I mentioned, there's that dosage effect, that the more adversities that you have, the more difficult the outcome. There are about 40 known outcomes, including morbidity, but obesity, diabetes, a whole host of outcomes, including risk behaviors. We also know that a higher A score is associated with criminality, both in youth, adolescents, and adults. Higher A scores are associated with criminality. We know that an individual who has a higher A score is more likely to become a victim of family violence, and we also know that somebody with a higher A score is more likely to become a perpetrator of family violence. Okay? And you guys have probably seen the pyramid of ACEs, so I'm going to go ahead and move past these pretty quickly. But basically, it starts with the idea that during your early childhood, it can lead to difficult neural development, social emotional learning difficulties. We're actually studying how ACEs during your childhood impacts adult attachment issues, which is predictive of lower hope. And what ultimately I'm going to argue for is that hope is a social gift. Hope is not something that takes place in isolation within me. It's something that we share. But if my parents have a high A score and have difficult attachment issues, it's difficult for them to be effective nurturing parents for me. And so it's associated with that cycle. Okay? So what we're learning is that the behavior that we're observing is now becoming more and more recognized as being a function of the trauma that individuals have experienced. And so more and more, especially across the state of Oklahoma, we're starting to navigate towards trauma-informed practices, which is one of the reasons that I'm here, is to talk about, as we learn more about ACE, the question becomes, what do you do about that? And what I'm going to argue is that hope is something that you probably need to consider. So when we hear the word trauma-informed practice, I want to make sure that what we're referring to is this idea that what has happened in our past has sort of predicted or led to this idea of distress that we experience, this mental health distress that influences our present. That is, higher trauma leads to maladaptive coping strategies. Higher trauma results in poor coping strategies, unhealthy coping strategies. So when we say the word trauma-informed or trauma-informed practice, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? I teach statistics, I can handle the silence. What does it mean? What does trauma-informed mean? Trauma-informed practice. What does it mean? Yeah?
I think of, understanding
That's exactly right. One piece of trauma-informed is understanding what trauma is and its impact on us. It also, yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Get to know the student and what their history and what's underlying that. Right. So what that means is, or what that leads to, is that as we have an increased understanding, we also have an enhanced capacity to respond to trauma. Now, trauma-informed practice isn't about what just happened to them and responding to them. It's also recognizing that learning about trauma and hearing about trauma from others can impact us as well. So trauma-informed practice is understanding and responding, but also creating a safe environment for self-care because of the emotional exhaustion associated with this issue. Okay? So one of the things that I'm going to argue for, and this is what we're traveling all over the country, Polly mentioned in Germany, been in Israel, going to Ireland this summer to do this work. And what we're pushing, what we're advocating from a data-driven framework, from a science perspective, is that what we're saying is trauma-informed and hope-centered. That we can understand and respond to trauma with a perspective towards what the future holds, could possibly hold, okay? So as I mentioned, the CDC, the national average of adverse childhood experiences is a 1.61. Children exposed to domestic violence in our communities, their average ACE score is a 4.4. And what this means is that as a child is exposed to family violence, they're not just exposed to family violence, they're exposed to other traumas as well, okay? Domestic violence survivors, average ACE score is a 3. Pushing buttons. Juvenile offenders, average ACE score is a 4.2. Foster children, average age score, and this is in our state, by the way, average ACE score, 5.68. I just finished a study of women in prison in Oklahoma, average ACE score out of 10, average ACE score, 7. Average ACE score is 7. Okay. So that's all about the ACEs, and what I want to highlight, it changed the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. I do want to highlight this. It does not excuse the behavior. I'm not suggesting we excuse the behavior. It's helping us understand the behavior, okay? And now, how do we begin to respond to that from the context of the future? So what we know, there are 2,000 published research studies on hope in the way that we study it, through medicine, through psychology, through social work, through the criminal justice system. There's just a tremendous amount of research. And what we know from that data is that it's linked to important behavioral and psychological assets, goal achievement, resilience, optimism, self-confidence. In education, hope, do you guys participate with the Gallup student assessment here in Enid? Okay. Gallup actually has a student assessment. They study about 1 million students, about 900,000 students across the US, 5th through 12th graders. And so what that research has shown, they study hope and engagement in school systems. And what they've found is that for middle school, hope scores are a significant predictor of average daily attainment and GPA. In high school, it's predictive of which courses, which electives students select. It predicts GPA, graduation rates. It predicts college going rates. Hope is a better predictor of first-year college performance than the ACT, SAT, or high school GPA. We know that. Okay? It's a better predictor of those educational outcomes. And more importantly, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, we know how to nurture hope. We know how to do this process. Okay? The problem is that with Gallup, what they've identified across these roughly 1 million students that they study every year is that only about 45% of the students report being hopeful. Most report being lower levels of hope or closer to hopelessness. Now, related to that is just over 40% of the students report being engaged in their education. And about 25, 26% of those students report being actively disengaged in the classroom. And what that means is they're actively trying to sabotage the classroom, right? And so the question is, if we know that hope is so important, why are scores so low across not just our youth, across our communities, right? So I'm going to start to talk a little bit more now about hope, but before I do, when I say the word hope, what comes to mind? What do you think of? When you heard optimism? When you heard that there was going to be a hope talk today, what came across? It's like, oh, here's butterfly and unicorns. Right?
Opportunity.
Opportunity, good. Optimism, opportunity. What else? Potential. Possibilities. Encouragement. Plan. Like that.
Thinking that something can get better.
Ah, I love that. Are you reading the slides ahead? Good, you're not. Good. All right. What else? Anything stand out?
Looking to the future.
Looking to the future. So hope is all of those, but more. It's related to optimism, but it's more. It's certainly a future orientation, but it's more than that. When I, where does hope come from? Is hope inside of us or is hope outside of us? Inside? Could be both. One of the studies that we found is that for youth, parents are drivers of hope, right? In this same study, what we did a comparison is children in the context of nurturing parents and children in the context of non-nurturing parents. And what we found is that in the absence of parents, community resources become an important driver of hope for them. So their connection to their community becomes very important for children who are struggling with their families. Okay? So for younger children, hope is being nurtured, but a lot of that control is outside of them. In a little while, I'll talk about when it leaves us, when it happens. Is hope a cognition? That is it a thought process, or is it an emotion? See, I hate to say both because everybody jumps on that one, right? Any thoughts? Is it a thought process, or is it an emotion? Or both? I'll give you that. Starts in mind, okay. So people study it both ways. I study it as a thought process. And the way in which we're talking about today is it's a cognitive process. And the reason that that's so important is because that thought process can be taught. More importantly, hope can be learned. We can teach hope. We know how to nurture hope. I'll talk about some of those strategies again in just a little bit. So three big takeaways. Number one, hope is easily measured. For children, it's a 6-item self-report measure. When I talked about all the Gallup stuff, it's children filling out 6 items. It's a scale that's validated for 7-year-olds to 17-year-olds. It's a good measure. Hope can easily be increased, but more importantly, hope is a social gift. Hope is something that we can share with each other. Here's how we define hope. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today, and you have the power to make it so. And that's the key distinction, the you have the power to make it so piece. Okay? It's not just optimism. It's not just a positive outlook on the future. It's the fact that you have influence over that. Now, let me break that definition down just a little bit. So hope is about setting goals. It's about identifying and setting goals in our lives. The critical aspect with hope is that we have to have this ability to identify pathways to our goals. We have to be able to identify the strategies of how to get there from here. Okay? Part of this pathways thinking is also being able to think about what are the potential barriers that I'm going to encounter, and how do I begin solving those barriers before I get there. So hope is about setting goals, identifying the pathways to achieve those goals, and then finally having the willpower to pursue those pathways. Willpower is the motivational piece. Okay? So what we would argue, what I would argue, what our research says, is that each and every one of us, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, we are pursuing goals. We are setting and pursuing goals in our lives. Whether it's in our family life, whether it's in our work life, our leisure life, or whatever important domains that we pay attention to, we set goals. The question is, can we identify how to get there? Okay? So for instance, in every one of us experience high and low hope. It ebbs and flows throughout our lives. So for instance, in my work life, where I have a requirement with the University of Oklahoma to publish and do research, I'm a pretty high hope person. I have the pathways of how to collect data, statistical analysis, and being able to do that process. I'm really motivated to do it. I love to do research. When I retire from the University of Oklahoma, this is exactly what I'm going to do. I love what I do. Imagine it. I get paid to wake up every morning and think about hope. That is so cool, right? My leisure life, I'm a low hope person. I'm a low hope person because I don't get to play tennis and golf and stuff very much anymore, if at all. And I don't really have strategies about how to overcome those barriers. So right now, I would be a lower hope person in my leisure life. So what I want to highlight is we all experience the ebb and flow of hope throughout our lives. Before I go any further, it just popped in my mind, when I'm talking about hope, what I'm not talking about is just the power of positive thinking. I'm not going to advocate that you should just wake up and be positive every morning. What I'm suggesting is that in moments of despair and adversity, we have to be able to identify strategies to achieve our goals, to overcome the barriers in our lives. Okay? Goals, pathway, willpower. Okay? And that is the complexity of hope theory. This is what I love about this idea, is its simplicity. Goals, pathways, and willpower. Now here's another one of my arguments with this. I think you already do this work. I think you already do hope work. What I'm going to advocate for is that you begin to conceptualize what you do in this language of hope, right? Because there's power in this idea that for all of you, you set goals in the work that you do. You set goals of what we're going to achieve in the classroom or with our teachers or staff. And so what you do during the course of the day are the pathways to achieve those goals. The hard work is the willpower piece. Getting people, getting students, getting people motivated to pursue those pathways, especially in the presence of adversity. And what I'll transition to is how do high hope and low hope people differ in this context. Okay? Goals, pathway, willpower. That's the complexity of it. Okay. So a little bit about goals. So goals can be in the short term or they can be in the long term. What we've learned about trauma, especially for children, is that they tend to be pretty good 24 to 48 hours out. But beyond that, high trauma people have a real difficult time thinking about the future and distinguishing hope from a fantasy. Right? Distinguishing hope from a fantasy. Okay? The other thing is that sometimes our goals are not their goals. And it has to be a goal they desire. It has to be something they want to achieve. Okay? What we've learned is that higher hope individuals tend to set goals that are achievement goals or approach goals. These are things that they have to learn new skills or develop new relationships in order to achieve. So these are stretch goals. What we've learned is that lower hope individuals tend to set avoidance goals. Okay? They set goals of things they want to avoid from happening. Okay? So, as an example, in high school, I spent a significant amount of my time in high school experiencing some homelessness issues. And when I graduated high school, looking back on it now, I kind of think it's amazing that I actually graduated high school, and I attribute that to some very important adults in my life there. But I realized on that last day of school that I had to figure out, what am I going to do? And in Helena, Oklahoma, Goldtree, Oklahoma, here's what I saw as my options. I could work on somebody's farm. I could work at the prison, the Crabtree Correctional Facility. I could go to prison, which was a potential, right? I could join the military, or I could go to college. So I went and enrolled in July, I think it was on July 29th, I enrolled at Northwestern Oklahoma State University, which meant that only the classes nobody else wanted were available, right? So I went to college that first year to avoid those other options. I went to college I didn't go to college to get a degree. I went to college to avoid those other options. My first semester GPA is a 0.58. It's a 0.58. Can anybody beat that? I've never met anybody that can. I've never met anybody who can crawl under that bar that I've set. That's what happens. I didn't see school as a pathway to the goals that I set. I saw school as an avoidance to the other goals. And so when you have an avoidance goal, what we want to think about is, how does that influence your pathways thinking? Right? If my goal is to avoid something, the way I think about pathways is just not doing those other things. Going to school going to classes was not a pathway for me, right? So Northwestern, in its wisdom, invited me to step away from the university for a while and reconsider my life, which I did. I got married at the age of 18, and ultimately went back to school, floundered around, changed my major physically 5 times, right? Because I was still in that avoidance thing. I was going to be a math teacher, and I failed college algebra and trig twice, right? So I had to change that. And then I took an intro to psychology class with Dr. Sawyer. Wayne will remember Dr. Sawyer. And my life completely changed, because I knew within about 2 weeks exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a college professor. And suddenly these other courses, general education, is now a pathway to the goal that I attained. I knew if I wanted to be a college professor, I had to go to graduate school. To go to graduate school, I had to have at least a 3.0 GPA. That's not easy, from a 0.58 to a 3.0. And so classes that previously had no meaning or interest or whatever suddenly became very important. And that is when my goal changed from avoidance to approach or achievement. And that's what we observe in our research. How do these intervention programs change the nature of the way people set their goals? Now, how often have we thought about or sort of been instructed that if somebody comes to us with a negative goal, we need to help them reframe that into a positive goal? So if a child comes and says, I want to stop fighting with I'll consider my life, I want to stop fighting with my sister. Somebody says, well, what you really mean is you want to have a positive relationship with your sister. As a hope researcher, what I'm going to tell you is I'm against that. Because they came to us from a negative avoidance goal perspective, and it's that avoidance goal that is going to influence the way they think about pathways. We can reframe that to a positive, but they're still thinking about positive or pathways from an avoidance perspective. And what our work has shown is you meet them where they are. They will make that transition. We have the capacity to re-goal, to change the nature of our goals. Okay? Pathways, again, as I mentioned, are the mental roadmaps to achieve our goals. Higher hope individuals, what we've found is that higher hope individuals are able to identify multiple pathways to their goals. They can tell you more than one way of how they can possibly get there from here. They can begin to think about barriers, problem solve. Higher hope individuals are better at problem solving. They're better at creativity than lower hope individuals. Lower hope individuals are going to face new goals with a focus on failure and negativity. And they're going to struggle to identify a pathway, but when they go down that pathway that you've helped them identify, the first time they hit a barrier, they're done. Right? They stub their toe and it's, I told you, you know, they wouldn't let me. So that's pathways thinking. Willpower is the motivational piece. It's the ability to direct your mental energy towards the pathway pursuits. Now, I don't have the time to go into this story, but here's the big takeaway. What we know is that willpower is associated with glucose in the blood. That willpower or mental energy is finite during the course of a day. We only have so much mental energy to give every day, right? How often do you come home mentally exhausted? When you're mentally exhausted, it's difficult to resist. So kids want at the end of the day, and you just, I can't fight it anymore. You give up, right? And so you can actually Google this. It's called the Radish Chocolate Chip Study. It's kind of a fun little study to read from Roy Baumeister out of Florida State University. Here's the big takeaway. If willpower is associated with the glucose in our blood, what is glucose? What's it for the human body? It's energy. It's energy. 68% of glucose is depleted generally through the brain, right? And so one of the big takeaways here is nutrition matters in the context of hope. Nutrition matters, right? In order to sustain mental energy, we have to have good nutrition. All right, goals, pathways, willpower. Got it? This is the last time I'll sort of kick it, and we'll move forward, okay? Goals, pathways, willpower. You have to have both to be hopeful. You have to have both pathways thinking and willpower to be hopeful. So, for instance, it may be that I'm highly motivated for the goal. I'm highly motivated to attain that goal. I just don't know how to get there from here. In that case, I would be considered a lower hope individual. I'm highly motivated, I just don't know how to get there from here. Alternatively, we have many programs that help people get there from here. They're just not motivated to go through those pathways. They're not motivated to do that work. And so we would classify them as lower hope individuals. You have to have both willpower and way power in order to be considered hope. So how often do you use the word hope? Every day. I hope it doesn't rain. Right? Hope you have a great day. Hope you're well. Right? We say that all the time. Now the problem is, I hope it doesn't rain means that I'm highly motivated for the outcome, but I don't have the pathways for that. And that, by the way, is how we distinguish hope from a wish. Okay? That's how we differentiate hope from a wish. This is an important piece. When we're talking about hope, we're not talking about wishing. Okay? Motivation without pathways is a wish. Hope is about action. It's about taking action to achieve the goals that you desire. Okay? So, it's the idea that the future will be better than today and you have the power to make it so. It's that pathways piece that differentiates hope. All right, so this is really dangerous. I usually make a joke depending upon where I'm at in the United States, but the University of Oklahoma has hope for a national championship. Right? Right? University of Texas has a wish. Okay? All right? You see the difference between hope and a wish? Let's forget this year. Let's forget this season. We're talking about from now on. Okay? Hope and a wish. Very important that we differentiate that. All right. What I want us to do is I want us to all just real quickly experience low hope. Okay? I want us all to remember and experience this for just a few minutes. So I want you to sort of indulge me. I'm going to have us do this kind of exercise collectively. I'm not going to have you get up and stand around and do all that. How many of you, like me, know how to drive a stick shift car? All right, so most of you. Okay, for those of you who don't have your hands up, have you tried? A few of you? Is there anybody here who doesn't know how to drive one, has never tried? Couple? Have you seen it done? Can you imagine doing it? All right, does anybody have a stick shift car we can borrow real quick? Because we can let you experience this, right? All right, by the way, one of the things I want to highlight is imagination is the instrument of hope. Okay? Imagination is the instrument of hope. You have to be able to imagine yourself in the future. Okay? You have to be able to do that. Hope is a cognitive process and requires our ability to imagine the way things could be. All right? So, remember when you first drove that stick shift car. Remember that very first time. Our goal, we want to drive. All right? But let's just make this a little bit hypothetical in that the only pathway we have available to us is a stick shift car. If we want to drive, we got to do that. Okay? So, for those of you who've done it, those of you who've tried it, and if you can stay with us to imagine it, what I want you to do is just remember for just a second, embrace that first time. Remember that, right? Are your palms sweating a little bit? A little bit? All right, so we've got the car started. We've got the clutch depressed. Let's go ahead and pretend we've got first gear. We figured that out because in some it could be reverse. And we're about to let the clutch out for the very first time. In that moment, for the very first time, we're just about to let that clutch out. So as we let that clutch out, what is our goal? So what I usually hear is not to stall the car. What I want to point out is that's an avoidance goal. That's an avoidance goal. We all experience it in our lives. We experience that. And so as we let that clutch out, let's remember we killed the car. Right? We stalled the car out. What's going through our mind? What's the self-talk? Failure? Embarrassment? I'll never get this. I can't do this. By the way, the level of support of the person sitting next to you is pretty important in the context of this. And that's self-talk. Hope is a social gift. Okay? I can't do this. It might get as damaging as I'm so stupid, I'm a loser, right? All of these negative self-talk. Did you quit? Did you quit? Why did you not quit? Challenge. Because we desired to go. I really, really wanted to drive. Here's the point. The more we desire the outcome, the more we're going to face adversity and try to overcome adversity to achieve our goals. The more we desire the goal, the more we're going to face that adversity and try to overcome it, right? Try to overcome it. Now let's say that we start the car back up. We're going to let that we're still in first gear because we haven't had that opportunity to get out of it yet. Let the clutch out, and in fact, we lurch forward. We're moving. We're hopefully in a parking lot that has no other vehicles in it, right? We're lurching, we're driving around. We've done it. We get in the car the third time. We get in the car the third time, we let the clutch out, and we kill it. What's going through our mind? What's the self-talk? Okay, so now you're starting to problem solve. What's going through your mind? I've done this before. I can do this. What I want to get at, and here's an important lesson, is that hope begets hope. Okay? It's a critical statement. Hope begets hope. Now, you may have heard that as success breeds success or success builds success. What I'm going to argue for is, as you consider this language of hope, it's hope begets hope. Because when I use the word hope, you know I'm talking about goals, pathway, and willpower. When you say success builds success, that can mean different things to different people. Okay? It's the language that's critical. So, I can do this. I've done this before, right? So we're going to keep trying. Pretty soon, we're now driving around. Now, we may still be an avoidance goal, that is, don't park on a hill, right? But the future, when we've driven a couple of different times, looks very different than it did that first time we killed the car. The possibilities are different here than when we killed the car the first time. Hope begets hope. And it's this idea that once I start to experience success, the opportunities of the future start to broaden and build. Does that make sense? Okay? So I learned to drive, luckily out in the country area of Goldtree, Oklahoma, and Helena, where you couldn't do much damage. By the way, I always noticed that the ditches are built up so that you can just kind of bounce off of them as opposed to kind of a deal. Hope begets hope. I can drive in Goldtree or Helena means that I can possibly drive in Enid. Creates stress, but it's possible. Once I drive in Enid, I can drive in Oklahoma City. Again, creates a little bit of stress, but it's possible. Once I drive in Oklahoma City, I can drive in Dallas. Right? Once I drive in Dallas, I just got off a ferry and drove in Seattle. Right? I just got off a plane last week in Oakland and drove through San Francisco. Anybody done that? That's a little stressful. Big highways. I got off a plane a couple years ago in Munich, and they gave us a car. By the way, it was a stick shift car, right? But it's possible. As anxiety-producing as that was, the future is now possible for me, because I at least know that part. I have a pathway. Okay? Hope begets hope. Okay? Now, this is the pathways piece, but the critical aspect of nurturing hope and experiencing hope is how well can you manage the willpower piece? How well can you manage your attention? Okay? So when I'm about to let that clutch out for the very first time, how much of my mental energy is required on the process of letting the clutch out? Almost all of it. How much of your mental energy is required to drive in today? How often do you drive today and don't remember the process of actually driving? Right? So the idea is that when we're first learning new pathways, it requires almost all of our attention and energy while the rest of life is going on. So while we're pursuing this new pathway, that we're trying to learn this new pathway, we have all these other competing priorities in our life that are demanding our attention. So when we have a high trauma individual, somebody with a lot of adversity in their background, and we're going to ask them to go down this new pathway, and by the way, lower hope people focus on new goals with failure and negativity, right? So they're coming at this with a focus on failure, and we're going to ask them to put that energy into this process. Okay? And that's the hardest part of nurturing hope, is managing the willpower. Okay? So what we know about trauma and unmitigated trauma is that trauma itself is not an attention detractor, it's actually an attention robber. Has anybody ever seen somebody trigger or experience high crisis? Come in with high crisis? What is going on with their willpower when somebody's triggered or in crisis? Right? You can't get them to focus on the pathway because they're in chaos. So what are some strategies that we have to soften that chaos in the moment? What do you do? How do you de-escalate them? Okay. These are pathways, right? But you're actually, as a practitioner, you're engaging in these pathways to do willpower work, right? So we might say something like, let's take a deep breath. You know, we might have some mindfulness type practices. We've published 3 or 4 studies on the impact of mindfulness practice and hope. We just finished a study on yoga. We're analyzing that data now and working with the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, part of looking at contemplative prayer as all of these processes to help people settle that willpower. Okay? So we've got to help people manage that process. So what is, I ask this at every presentation, what is the opposite of hope? Despair? Despair? That's usually what I get, is despair. And as a good, nurturing professor of statistics, what I'll tell you is you're wrong. It's apathy. The opposite of hope is apathy. That in this process of becoming hopeless, we experience despair, but ultimately it's apathy. What is hopelessness? Hopelessness is the idea that the outcome has already been decided and there's nothing I can do to change it, right? There's no sense trying, I'm gonna fail. I'm not gonna put any energy into it. When a 3rd or 5th grade child is laying their head down on a desk and exhibiting apathy, what's going on with them, right? The outcome has already been determined. There's nothing they can do to change the outcome. That child in my hypothetical example doesn't see that classroom as a pathway to the goals they desire. Right? It's probably also worth making a statement right now that if my goal is to get money for this weekend and my pathway is I'm going to rob the DA when we step out of the class, which would be a bad idea, by the way. But that's going to be my pathway, and I'm really motivated to do that. I'm a high hope person. Okay? We have to be really careful about assigning a moral kind of value to this idea of hope. Now, what we learned from that example is that many people have dysfunctional pathways, and they're good at that. Okay? And so sometimes we have to re-examine those pathways, provide alternative pathways available to them. Okay? So what happens when our goals are significantly blocked? We experience emotion. And I'm not sure your name, but that's exactly how you describe the difference. Is when our goals are blocked, we experience negative affect. When we are successful in pursuing our goals, we experience happiness and joy. Okay? But what happens when our goals are blocked, many of us, some of us, have the capacity to re-goal, to change our goal. Right? So when I was growing up in Helena, I thought I was going to be a baseball player. Right? I thought I was really good at baseball. Then you get to college and you find out that there's a lot of people who are really good at baseball. And it turns out you have to be able to hit a baseball to play baseball, right? And so I realized that I wasn't going to get to play baseball. So I had to re-goal. I could play intramural softball. I could play competitive softball. There are other things I can do associated with that. I could re-goal, right? Sometimes we have the capacity to come up with alternative pathways. If I can't hit a baseball right now, I can go to a batting cage. I can get a batting coach and find those strategies, right? But if my pathways and goals are significantly blocked, then I begin to experience despair. But let's think about despair for a moment. Despair is this idea that something that I desire is being blocked. I am experiencing anxiety, anger, frustration, the real possibility that I'm going to fail. But I have a lot of mental energy or willpower towards the goal. Earlier I said that's low hope. It's not the opposite of hope. So here's what I'd want to ask you to consider. Shout it out if you can think of it, but where have you seen despair? Where have you seen despair in your work? Okay? Working with a CASA team, Court-Appointed Special Advocates team, when I asked that question, where have you seen despair? Immediately one of the CASA workers said, when parents abduct a child. That's despair. And I thought, man, that is such a great example, because parents desire the outcome of reunification. Good goal. The only pathway that they saw available to them was very dysfunctional, and it was to abduct a child. They were hopeful in that moment in the context of despair. Okay? We could all agree that abducting your child is probably not going to result in anything good for anybody involved, right? But it's the only pathway those parents saw available to them in that context. Okay? So while we study hope, I want us to couch it in what does it look like in despair? How do we nurture hope to somebody who's experiencing despair? More importantly, how do we nurture hope to somebody who's apathetic? And we'll talk about those strategies after the presentation. That's where my interest is hope in that context. Okay? Any comments on that? Any comments on that? Does that make sense? Despair and apathy? We do know how to nurture hope. And it's the process that's important. Again, after the break, I'm going to kind of walk us through a couple of strategies about how to nurture hope. All I'm going to do is show you the process, but I'm going to invite you to become much more creative about that process than a statistician. Okay? And we'll talk about some of those alternatives. But nurturing hope starts with goal setting. It starts with that idea of setting a goal that somebody desires and exploring and nurturing that goal-setting process. Because what happens when somebody starts to imagine the possibility of a goal is their willpower will slightly increase. By the way, you have to do willpower work before you can do pathways work. You can't set pathways before they're motivated. They have to imagine that it's possible before you can start to get the pathways work. So we start with goal setting, and that's one of the worksheets that I'll walk us through. Once we identify or we've set the goal, then we go through this process of identifying viable pathways. There's actually a process of basically brainstorming possible pathways, then exploring the barriers, the likely barriers, so that we get at viable pathways, that is pathways that are more likely. By the way, when you ask a child what they want to be when they grow up, and they say, I'm going to be an NBA basketball player, right? So we actually have a process to work with that child and say, okay, let's step that out. What's it going to take to get there? And what we'll ultimately probably agree on is that in many cases, setting the goal of being an NBA basketball player is fantasy. It's more fantasy than it is hope. But if we can help them engage in the planning and pathways process and do a stepping process of, in order to be an NBA basketball player, what do you have to be able to do? In order to be able to do that, what do you do? And so we step it backwards so that what they do today matters. And in that conversation, it's not a 5-minute conversation, but in that conversation, going to school matters. Going to school is a pathway to being an NBA basketball player because you got to play and you got to get visibility. School is one pathway to that. Okay? The third box is creating future memories of success. What we're talking about is setting down with the individual and exploring with them in a very deliberate process of imagining themselves achieving the goal, but also spending a significant amount of time, for instance, exploring what that success looks like. What we know is that higher hope individuals tend to set goals that are pro-social. That is, goals that benefits others. So if we go through this process, ultimately, we're going to hear about achieving a goal is not just good for me, but it's good for my family. It's good for my friends. It's good for all of these other things. And that is a kind of a simplistic process. Again, I'll take you through some worksheets on how to do this. Okay. So real quickly, Camp Hope. I'm not intending to show you a scientific presentation of data, but what I want to highlight is we actually created a 1-week intervention with high trauma kids that is non-therapeutic intervention. And I'm going to show you what we did with Hope. So this is a group of children across the United States. There were ultimately 822 kids ages 7 to 17. By the way, we don't put 7-year-olds with 17-year-olds in this intervention. They're age grouped or developmentally aged or grouped. What I'll highlight is average age of these kids was 10. Okay, average age was 10. And the average A score was a 4.4. Let me just say that going into this intervention, these were a lot of rage-filled youth. Very angry youth, okay? Now the intervention is grounded in hope theory. It's about goals, pathway, and willpower. And it's a challenge by choice experience. Every morning, the child wakes up and sets goals of what they want to achieve. And that goal could be things like, I'm going to do a zip line experience. I'm going to do canoeing, even though I can't swim. I'm going to do whitewater rafting, or I'm going to ride a horse. So, and then the curriculum throughout the day is about pathways. It's about generating strategies to achieve their goals. They're little groups that they're in throughout the entire week, small groups of about 10 kids together. It's called a hope circle, right? So they're together the whole time. There's a few other things about the curriculum. The curriculum is actually called Igniting Hope curriculum. Again, these are the A scores and the prevalence for these kids. What I want to point out is just under half of them have an incarcerated parent. 80% of them have witnessed domestic violence. You can see the abuse and neglect. So these are pretty traumatized kids, okay? This is their hope 2 weeks before camp, last night of camp, and a 1-month follow-up of hope. By the way, a 2-point increase in hope scores in the education hope literature is a letter grade. Raising a child's hope 2 points is the difference between an A and a B in their GPAs, or a D and a C. Okay? So significant increases in a child's hope. I actually tracked 100 of these kids in San Diego for a full year, and I can tell you that they sustained hope. Those hope scores did not go down. The increase from pre to post was predictive of their academic achievement the following semester. There were 12 kids from San Diego who ultimately graduated high school last year. All 12 who were eligible graduated, eligible meaning age-wise. For those 12, that was an amazing experience to have that graduation. All 12 of those kids are in college today still, right, from this experience. By the way, once we did the assessment of the child's hope, we also asked adults to observe those children's behavior both before and after camp. And what we found is that increasing the child's hope, their own hope, was predictive of positive character behaviors as observed by adults after the fact. So what we found was an increase or prediction of self-control, social intelligence, gratitude, and curiosity. So it changed the child's behaviors in those areas. Okay? So I do want to argue that hope is a social gift. It is not something that happens in isolation, that we can intentionally destroy hope. We can unintentionally destroy hope, and we can do the same thing with nurturing hope. Right? In the book, there's a little bit of my stories in chapter 19, but I have a middle school, ultimately became my high school basketball and science teacher, and he's the reason I'm alive today. He's actually the reason why I chose not to pull the trigger when I was in the 7th grade. And that coach, teacher, knew all the stuff that I was going through. I'm an 8 on the ACE. And so he knew a lot of the stuff that I was experiencing. He came up and he sat down beside me, leaned into me for a while, just leaning in, and he made this comment: everything's going to be okay. And that was all he said. And he's the person that just made it. It gave me, in that moment of time, it gave me the mindset that I mattered. And that is so critical in nurturing hope, is you have to believe you matter. Okay? Now, what I will also tell you in this context is that a couple of years ago, actually I think it's about 5 years ago, I was back in Helena and I went to visit this person, this coach. And I was at a basketball game. And one of the things, you guys, has anybody done the gratitude exercise? You guys heard that? Where you write a thank you letter to somebody who made a significant impact on your life. The idea is that if you do that exercise, if you actually deliver it, it has an even more pronounced effect. Well, I decided to do that with this. And I told my the other faculty and students in my Hope Research Center, I said, you know, I'm going to go see this guy and I'm going to do this. And I'm going to predict what the outcome's going to be. You know, I told him, here's what I think is going to happen. And it panned out. So here, to me, is the big takeaway. So I'm sitting with him. In fact, I never even watched the basketball game. I just sat with him for about an hour and a half. And I finally leaned into him, very intentionally, leaned into him. I was quiet for a little bit, and he's kind of looking at me. And I said, you're the reason I'm alive today. You know? And then I told him kind of the story. And this is what I predicted. This is what he said. I did what? He didn't even remember it, right? What I would tell you is that's who he was. He didn't remember it. That's just who he was with the kids around him. But my point is that we can nurture hope intentionally or unintentionally. The way we interact with each other matters. And I think that if hope is important, we ought to become a little more intentional about our interactions with each other. Okay? One of the things that, in terms of thinking about, and I'm last couple slides. When we think about trauma-informed and hope-centered, we have to start rethinking the way our organizations are set up. We have to think about our organizational processes. One of the individuals that I do a lot of work with in the state of Washington, Thurston County, is the district attorney. And he started to talk about whether or not his processes in the courtroom force avoidance goals. He was talking specifically about drug court and veterans court and those things. But do the processes force an avoidance goal in the participants? Does it force them to have to think about what they can't happen, right? And how do you begin to reframe your organizational processes and structure so that they're more achievement-oriented? How do we start becoming a little more hope-centered in our organizational processes? And so just some of the strategies, you have to start with an awareness, which is what this process is. Get people familiar with that language and that process. You have to determine whether or not it's something, character strength that is valued. And then you have to develop strategies, reading clubs, staff meetings, things along that nature. What I want to get at, and we'll do this again after the break, is we know how to nurture hope in individuals and in groups. And we can think about what role does a school counselor have in nurturing hope. And we can talk about what role does a teacher have in nurturing hope. And we can have a conversation about what role a principal or an assistant principal or the superintendent's office have on nurturing hope. And what you have to remember is that you break it down into goals work, pathways work, and willpower work. And we know those strategies. So in goal setting, we could just have the individual identify and make a list of relevant goals, rank order them. We can ask them to start thinking about what are those pathways, rank order them, talk about barriers. We can do willpower work, what motivates you. Here's an example. What is the single best movie you've seen on hope? Star Wars? The fourth one? The New Hope? That's good. Blindside? By the way, I'm not going to let you claim Shawshank Redemption or Good Will Hunting. Those are mine. You can't have those. What's the best movie you've seen on hope? Pay It Forward. Rudy? One more. Apollo 13? What was it about that movie that... Yeah. So what would happen if they didn't overcome some of those barriers? Yeah, they would die. So and we don't necessarily have a whole lot of time, but if I can set and just have a little bit of conversation about the movie Apollo 13, what was it about that movie, and then start to get your perspective of, most of the time it's going to be a conversation about people overcoming extreme adversity. And what you do is you start to look for that willpower, that energy that person has, that movie resonates with them. And so you can begin to use those strategies in the short term to do willpower type work. Okay? We'll talk about these a little bit more. I think we're towards the end. Yeah. Yeah, a break would be good. This is my favorite quote on hope at the very top. Is at the heart of change. You have to be able to imagine the way things are right now, or to understand the way things are right now and be able to imagine the way things could be. And that's the essence of hope.
As you go out for break, those of you that aren't familiar with our facility, there are restrooms as you go out on the right. If you are an Enid Public Schools principal or counselor, we have pre-ordered for you the book Hope Rising. You may check it out from one of the tables. If you're not fortunate enough to be employed by Enid Public Schools as one of those people, the other table has books that you can buy. They are $20. There's credit card, cash, and checks available for you. If you need anything else to help you navigate through the morning, just let us know. We want to have you be comfortable here while you're learning. There are cookies that have been placed out for you now, and more coffee and water. So help yourself and relax and be back here in 15 minutes. Thank you.
So let's come together in about a minute, just wrap it up. About a minute. Or faster. Okay, usually when I do these hope workshops and trainings, I very specifically like to take a pretty decent break after me standing up here droning along, partly because I know oftentimes you don't get that social time very often to experience that, but more importantly, what I wanted the opportunity was for you to just kind of let some of what you just heard kind of rattle around and sort of contemplate with it and start to sort of think about sort of what questions might have, what clarifications, or for instance, you know, I get questioned pretty frequently, what's the relationship between hope and resilience, or other things, but any questions or comments so far?
Yeah, what is your difference between hope and resilience? What would that be?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to lead that in there, right? So, yeah. So as this ACEs movement is evolving and emerging across our state and other states, resilience is sort of the framework of the way in which we talk about responding. And so I told you just a brief kind of glimpse of some of my story. And so people who knew me during that time would see me now standing up here in front of you as a professor from the University of Oklahoma, and they'd say, man, you're really resilient, you know, to what you had. So here's my framework, and I want to couch this in saying that whatever resilience is, I think it's good. I'm just not sure what it is. And what I mean by that is there's no common definition of what we mean by resilience. There's no common way to think about it. In psychology, we talk about it as a bouncing back to something. And the groups that I work with child maltreatment, domestic violence, homelessness, poverty, and all the stuff that goes with that, I don't want them bouncing back to that. I want them going forward to that. So if the definition is bouncing back, I have a little bit of problem with the term resilience. Now, if you talk about positive adaptation to adversity, then I'm a little more comfortable with it. Here's my takeaway. Hope is the mindset that drives resilient behaviors. You have to have hope in order to engage in resilient behaviors. If you don't have a perspective that the future is possible, being resilient is almost irrelevant or survival focused. Okay? The other problem that I have about resilience is that we oftentimes say the word, like, you're resilient, And we make this assumption that you're always resilient, that it's like a personality attribution. You're a resilient person. And what I would want to say is, I think I'm okay today, tomorrow maybe not so much, right? I mean, when things trigger, when stress happens, when other stuff comes on, I may or may not respond to that well. I think it ebbs and flows in our lives. So I'm kind of at that place where I say hope is the mindset that drives resilient behaviors. And the reason I say behaviors is because I think we can observe the way people behave and say that that's resilient, but we really can't do much with what's going on in their minds, kind of thing. I've conducted a couple of studies. We're actually working on one right now that we'll submit for publication, where we've measured hope and resilience and well-being, and what we found is that hope was the better predictor of well-being than resilience. So now I want to come back and say that I think that when we talk about resilience in a community and things and protective factors and things that come up, I think that's the right conversation, right? I think we need to figure out, okay, what happened to you? Now what do we do about that? And it's natural to think about resilience, but what I would encourage you is that hope is the mindset that drives resilient behaviors. And we know how to nurture hope. And the science behind hope is good and strong. So that's kind of my reaction to it. I have to be really careful because if you Google my name and Dr. Seuss, which by the way, I can retire now because you can Google my name and Dr. Seuss together, right? But I actually write about that in the ACEs Connection blog and provide a little bit more in-depth detail about that. I'm being careful about poking that resilience thing because I think it's the right way to think about how do we move forward, right? It's just I think we could do that with a focus on the science of what works. Okay? All right. What else? What other questions do you have? Or concerns about what I just said? Yeah. Yeah, Camp Hope. Camp Hope is, there are two in Oklahoma. There's one in Oklahoma City and there's one in Tulsa. And it's tied to our Family Justice Center system. Yeah, it's just in Oklahoma City. So our Family Justice Centers are a one-stop shop for domestic violence. So it's the co-location of partner agencies in one location. So the kids are referred to like Palomar is in Oklahoma City. The kids don't have to be from that domestic violence, but they have to have a kind of this background and history of trauma. Kids and families can't be in crisis, but they can be referred to Camp Hope through that organization. It is, as I mentioned, it's a one-week camp. Right now it's in 15 states across the United States. Next year it'll be in 22, and Verizon is the funder across the U.S. I can certainly send the evaluation report, which goes into more detail about the curriculum of Igniting Hope. I will tell you the first year we did the evaluation, it didn't look good at all. And that's the way you got to start, right? And then you use that data to help inform how the curriculum is developed and the strategies. And you know, third, fourth, fifth year into it, the results look like that every time. So it's pretty powerful now. Yeah. So the goal is for all 50 states to have Camp Hope. We need more. We need more of those. It's free for the kids. There's no cost to the child. Any other questions? How do you respond now that you know about hope, goals, pathway, and agency when you hear the term, where there's a will, there's a way? Because that's a hope statement. Where there's a will, there's a way. How do you react to that? It's a positive? Okay, yep. Because you certainly have to have willpower and energy to look for, to find, and to pursue pathways. For lower hope individuals, people who have a repeated history of failed attempts, we have to be careful about that statement because it can be equated with what you saw in the movie Resilience, which is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Just, if you've got enough motivation, if you've got enough want to, you can make this happen. And for lower hope individuals, if we work really hard to get them motivated to begin a pathway, we need to work very hard with them to pursue that pathway because we run the risk of one more failed attempt. Just getting them motivated and getting out of the way can be dangerous for a lower hope person. What happens when a goal is not clearly defined? It's hard to know what pathways, you're not really, you're kind of meandering in that process. All right. What other questions do you have? I have a much more enjoyable time if we have a discussion. Yeah.
What has been your experience with hope in the elderly?
Hope in the elderly. So what we know from a research world is that well-being indicators increase with age, which is part of that experience. When we think about well-being in general, it kind of transitions from this idea of, on the one hand, I'm trying to think of how to say it, it's hedonic versus eudaimonic well-being. And what that means is hedonic is sort of the pleasure principle. We want to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. Eudaimonic well-being is about the journey. It's about finding meaning and purpose in your activities. And that's where we want hope to go. We want to nurture hope so that people can find meaning and purpose in their suffering, or meaning and purpose as providing wisdom or frameworks for how they're going to achieve the future. I can tell you from my standpoint that every day that I get to do something like this, standing here in Enid, Oklahoma, thinking about my experiences in Helena, and to have been all over the place, but to finally get to come back here, it's almost like everything now makes sense because it led me to here today. And that's pretty cool. So when I think about hope in the elderly, what I've been interested in is hope in the context of hospice. And so if hope is a future orientation, what does hope look like at the end of life? And so what we see is the real experience of the way people can re-goal. And so you shift from your own immortality to setting the goal about making peace. And so that's wisdom and experience comes into play a little bit more with the older you get. So, yes? Yeah, yeah. Sure. So when you're thinking about hope in the context of basic needs, when people are hungry or surviving, and where does that fit in the context of hope? Is that okay? So what we have found is that there is a small relationship between basic needs and hope. It's important, but it's not a barrier to nurturing hope. By the way, I think everything that you talked about that you do in a case management framework, those are all pathways of hope, of helping those clients achieve, those high school students achieve those goals. And that's why I think you all are pathways of hope for the people that you work with. Now, there's a difference between, let me ask this, is hope for me as a professor at the University of Oklahoma the same as it is for the homeless youth in Tulsa? Is our hope the same? So I'll create just a little bit of frustration for you. I think it is. I think it is the same. Because it's goals, pathway, and willpower. Now I have access to resources that give me different opportunities for pathways than it does for the homeless youth. I set goals that may be a little different than the homeless youth. We've studied the homeless youth, and oftentimes the goals are to become homeless because it's safer, it's perceived as safer in that context. So becoming homeless was the goal in that. What we find is that in extreme adversity, like barely making basic needs meet, is that your hope becomes survival hope. What you hope for becomes much more about day-to-day living. And we're working with the homeless on developing curriculum about goal setting on that very issue. So, yes?
When you work, I work in an elementary school. Our nurturing is kind of daily things like this. When you're working with a younger child, do you also want to nurture hope in the family? Is there a way to do that?
Sure. Yeah, so she works in an elementary school and working to nurture hope every day. When working with a child, do we also pay attention to the family is the question. I think first of all, I think that the strategies of nurturing hope for pre-K and kindergarten is different than it is for maybe second, third, fourth, fifth. By the way, the single best book on hope is Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You'll Go, which is why I put in that ACES connection, I talk about that book. And we can talk about nurturing hope with pre-K and kindergarten. But I think one of the things that we're fortunate about in Tulsa with our early childhood and the George Kaiser Family Foundation and Educare as a framework is recognizing that you do have to wrap around with the family. Because especially for younger children, that's why I said earlier, is hope inside us or outside of us? And there's so much of that that's outside a child's control. And so I think working holistically with the family is the right approach. But it doesn't negate the importance and the work that you guys already do on helping us learn that we matter. Yes?
One of the strategies, obviously, is visible pathways. So what are some of the visualization techniques that are used for students that have the construct of, this is my norm, I don't know how to look at a hopeful, visible way of looking at something realistically. So what are some visualization strategies you would use specifically with students?
Yeah, so one that just pops into my mind that we're doing out in Washington is we're doing a visual board or a gallery board, and we're basically having students go out and they'll take pictures of what their goals, that's things that might symbolize their goals, and then we'll come back or they'll come back and they'll talk about each of those pictures, and then sort of in that conversation identify the ones that are probably the most important or relevant, or and then they write a narrative about that. We print out the picture, they print out the picture and write that narrative about it. And then we do the same thing. I keep saying we, and what I mean is they do that with pathways, and then they do that with willpower. And then at the end of a 5-session, they have a hope board. Or a gallery of hope. It's a visual aid in that process. We measure hope before and we measure hope afterwards and see a significant increase. It makes it tangible, it makes it real. Doing it individually and then with a group is really important, because the way that you see and think and characterize pathways may not have ever occurred to me. And what we have to really remember is that imagination is the instrument of hope. And so I can learn through the vicarious learning stuff other pathways. The other thing is that we're doing some programs where We're taking about 9th and 10th grade students, a small group of them, and these are folks who are identified by the school counselors, not in a large group, very specifically. These are folks that have, I don't know why I have my phone, incredible potential and are not expected to graduate high school. They're expected to drop out given their life circumstances. So this small group, for instance, will take trips to visit universities. And it's amazing that once you see the physical aspects of a university, a person can begin to imagine seeing themselves there, and then you can do the pathways work. If you don't work on the idea of them being able to see themselves achieving it, doing the pathways work becomes difficult. It's not a 5-minute process. So that's a couple. Yeah.
And then in Camp Hope, what are the credentials of the people that are working in Camp?
Yeah, so every state's a little bit different because the way there are family justice centers. Some family justice centers run through the district attorney's office, some run through the mayor, some are 501c3s and all of that. In Tulsa, it's a partnership with the YMCA, and so the YMCA vets the counselors. The Family Justice Center model has very specific criteria of background, those kinds of things. What we're starting to see is more and more graduates of Camp Hope becoming counselors. And at least in Tulsa, we train the counselors. We give them an opportunity to be trauma informed before they go to camp. So it's not, when you take rage-filled youth to camp, you're going to get rage-filled actions, and you need to be ready for that. So, I can get a little more of that detail, of that criteria. Yes? Yeah, so I think, we'll go through some of these worksheets here in a few minutes just to really experience the process, but then I think then we have to, even potentially work in smaller clusters like in your alternative school to think very specifically. I don't think it's necessarily a cookie cutter approach, but I think the process is what we need to be attentive to: goals, pathway, and willpower. And not every kid needs to go to college. Most states, it's only what, quarter to a third of the population have a college degree. But I think it's not just higher education. It's probably going out and looking at some industries, some growth industries and possibilities. And again, it's building that imagination of what could be for them. So we do a little bit of work with our alternative schools, Phoenix Rising and others with adjudicated youth in that regard. Yes? Right. So with Camp Hope, the average age is 10, and the average A score is a 4. So they have 8 more years to accumulate more. And so one of the ways that we think about nurturing hope is that, I'm doing work today, setting goals and creating pathways, but what I'm really doing is I'm building an opportunity to give that child coping resources, or it's that hope begets hope framework. Because in that Camp Hope model where we did pre, post, and follow-up, we're pretty intentional about measuring hope on the last night of camp because we're sending them back home to that environment. And so the way we have dealt with that, it's the reason why we track the kids for a full year, is because we wanted to provide the scientific evidence that having monthly clubs and follow-ups are so critical. So the kids go home, but they're part of an ongoing club where that their hope circle comes back once a month. And they come back for a 2-hour meeting, of which 1 hour is programming, goals, pathway, and willpower. And then they go to a baseball game, or they go, and in that context, it's not just the kids. The kids are in programming, and then parents or caregivers are also learning goals, pathway. So we're trying to build the evidence of this kind of continuation and sort of wraparound attempt. But, you know, that's why I struggle a little bit with the resilience, you know, because if we do send them back, we don't know what trauma they're going to experience. But you start to, you know, some of the things that have been done in education settings, for instance, is doing an exercise like that video board or some other action, but you measure hope for your kids, and you pair high hope kids with low hope kids. What we're finding is that high hope kids hang with high hope kids, and low hope kids hang with low hope kids. And so what was of interest was what happens if you pair them up. And preliminaries showing some pretty decent outcomes where the lower hope kid is taking some stuff from the higher hope kid, and vice versa. So I think we've got ongoing work to do, but you know, we're building the possibility that the future can be better than today. Here's my big takeaway with all my work in domestic violence, child maltreatment, is that hope is a significant predictor in allowing us to overcome our adversities, but hope is also a significant predictor in allowing us to live well within our adversities. And I think that's pretty important to recognize as well. All right? All right, I'm going to move on, but if you have any questions maybe afterwards, I'd be happy to take that. So what I want you to do, you're going to pair up. I'm not going to ask you to share anything with a larger group about your specific, what we're going to do. We're going to do a goal setting exercise. But I want you to pair up, and how many of you have gone through goal setting exercises? Yeah, we all have, right? So here's one more that we're going to get to do. But I created this worksheet in the context of hope, based upon what we've learned about high hope and low hope individuals. I've already mentioned that high hope individuals are more likely to set achievement goals. Lower hope individuals are more likely to set avoidance goals. But if you look at this sheet that's titled your personal and professional goal worksheet, it's the table in the middle that kind of matters in this process. So what I'm going to have you do is work in a pair, two people working together, and you're going to take turns. So I'm going to write down 1 to 3 of my personal or professional goals. And by the way, it doesn't really matter. It's going through this process that I want you to experience. So each of you, we're going to set 1 to 3, up to 3 personal or professional goals. And then I'm going to have you go through this process of understanding the nature of those goals. And so if I set the goal of, you know what, I want to increase my ability to play tennis, right? That's a horrible example, by the way, but it's heavy on my mind. And so when we typically sit down and talk about, here are my goals, that's fine. For instance, my goal might be, you know what, I'm eligible for retirement in our teachers' retirement system in 4 years. And, you know, I want to have good financial stability. when I retire. That's a good goal. That's what I want. Now, when we hear that, we all agree, oh, that's a good goal. But if you start to ask me more questions about it, what you might learn is that that's actually an avoidance goal. That I came from a history of trauma and I had to take care of my parents. And so I'm going to be doing all of these. So my investment strategies are probably going to be maybe a little more conservative. What I'm saying is that learning about the nature of the goal is going to help you do the pathways work in a little bit. Okay? So just real quickly, I've already talked about approach versus avoidance. The next question is, how difficult? What's the degree of difficulty in achieving that goal? Is it low, moderate, or hard? Is this a stretch versus a mastery goal? And a stretch goal, obviously, is something that's really I'm going to have to work hard to do. I'm going to have to learn things. The mastery goal, what I mean by that in this context is that lower hope individuals tend to set goals where they've already got everything they need to achieve it. Lower hope individuals will not set themselves up for failure. Okay? So they've already got everything they need. Time to completion, is it a short-term goal, long-term goal? Degree of change, is this going to radically change my life or not? Support networks, probably more important is to think about the potential detractors. So who are the negative people in your life? Who are the people who are going to contribute to the I can't, right? Or they won't let me. Now chances are there's not a whole lot you can do about that, right? But recognizing that they're there and that they're contributing to that, I think, is quite important. And then beneficiaries, I already mentioned that higher hope individuals tend to set goals that are pro-social. My intent with this worksheet is that as I tell you my goal, you use this as a guide for conversation to learn more about my goal. And you don't have to just go, one through. It's intended to be a conversation, right? For you to learn more about the nature of my goal before we do pathways work, okay? So what I want you to do is just take turns. Each of you write, identify 1 to 3, and then try to go through, have a conversation and go through this process. And we'll probably take about 15 minutes total. So you're going to have to kind of get through it. I just want you to experience the process, okay? When one of you finishes, flip it to the other one. Make it happen. Because you make those things possible, right? You can advocate in a way that nobody else is trained to advocate in that framework. So, me too. All right. Let's come back together. Okay. All right. Good job. Better job. Good job. All right. General comments from that experience? Good. One thing I want to make a couple of statements in the process that kind of came up in some of the questions or conversations is one of the things to remember and think about with hope is that a goal that I achieve today is nothing more than a pathway for the goal I set for tomorrow. Okay, so goals and pathways become somewhat interchangeable in that context. The other thing is when you're working with people, what may be a goal that I have and recognizing a goal that you have is that my goal may be a pathway for your goal or vice versa. So it can provide a framework that makes it easier to work together in what may be not necessarily opposing goals, but not necessarily aligned. And then finally, when you learn and have a discussion about the nature of the person's goals, it is from their perspective. And so what may be an avoidance goal to you is an approach goal to them or vice versa. It's their perspective. And then I've gotten this question the last 3 times I've done the workshop is, what happens if the goal seems to be a little bit of both, avoidance and approach? And so, ultimately what I'm trying to get at is what's motivating this goal? What's really driving why you set that goal? And I have no problem with the fact that it can be a little of both. Because ultimately when we move and transition to the HOPE worksheet, which I'm just going to show you next, we don't have time to necessarily go through the process, but those things will emerge. Those processes will emerge. Any questions or concerns about the sheet? I did provide those in Microsoft Word, so I don't really have a proprietary framework on those. Polly has those, so if anybody wants them and wants to use them, feel free to do that. My only request to you is that if you use any of these forms, at some point, could you reach out and just let me know? So if it's working, not working, things that you would have changed or did change is helpful for me for the next groups that I work with. Any comments or concerns? Usually when I do this in an all-day training and workshop, what I have you do is each of you write down your 3 goals before I give you the sheet, and then just have you share each other's goals. And then I have you go through the worksheet, and what you experience generally is after the worksheet you have a much deeper understanding and appreciation of what that goal meant than just, I want to play tennis once a week kind of thing. All right, I'll do the statistics professor pause for a second. Any other?
Can you do, I was a little bit foggy on the stretch versus mastery. Can you talk about that again?
Yeah. what I'm trying to get at with that, and I've kind of wrestled with that language a little bit, stretch versus mastery. What I mean by stretch is probably what everybody recognizes, which is I'm going to have to, I mean, this is a goal that I can't achieve where I'm at today. I've got to take some classes. I've got to, you know, I realized after a 0.58 that I wanted to be a college professor. That's a stretch goal, right? But it's also possible. I've got to get a GPA up. I've got to, these are the pathways so it became a stretch goal for me. What I mean by mastery, and this is where I think I need to figure a different term for that. Mastery, all I mean by that is that the person is setting a goal that they're not going to have to stretch themselves. They don't have to put forward a whole lot of effort to make this happen. And what we found in our research with goal setting is that lower hope individuals don't set themselves up for failure. They're going to set a goal that they're likely to attain. Yeah, I hope that helps. If anybody has an idea of the way I could change that word, I think it's the difficulty in the term that I'm using. Yeah? Okay, so how about if we just walk through this HOPE worksheet? So there's two documents. One is the HOPE worksheet directions, and that identifies each item in the worksheet, sort of its intent and process. Here's kind of the history of this. What we have done is we've measured HOPE before doing this worksheet and then HOPE after doing the worksheet. This is the one where we see a statistically significant increase in HOPE in 1 hour. There's a publication out on this process that says that HOPE can be improved in 90 minutes or less. So we're pretty happy with the way this worksheet has performed. The problem with it was there was always the assumption that people knew what their goals were. And what I learned in doing these workshops is that's not always the case, which is why I created the goal setting worksheet. But this one works. By the way, and I'll walk through it in a minute. I have a number of agencies who are using it with clients and students, and sort of because it's some pathways work in here. I also have organizations. The district attorney in Thurston County, for instance, has started using this worksheet as opposed to performance appraisals. So they now do goal setting evaluations as opposed to retrospective performance evaluations. So I think it has a lot of application. I do this individually. I also do it with groups. So like if I'm setting with an organization, we can set organizational goals or workplace goals and then walk through this together as kind of a team building framework. So what I want you to, we'll just kind of walk through here. So the first question is actually what you just went through. Describe your goal in as much detail as possible. So now you can just take what you did from the worksheet. Seems like a silly question. Question 2, how much do you desire this goal? But what I'll tell you is that when you're working with somebody, excuse me, and they don't circle a great amount, filling out this worksheet is a lot of work. It becomes a lot of work and effort to get them to fill it out because they just don't desire it enough to, it's like the stick shift car, right? You start to hit those barriers and it's kind of hard to keep going forward.
I have a question.
Yes?
What if they do desire it, but they're afraid to say they desire it because they're afraid of failure?
Sure. Well, I think fear of failures, among other things, are going to greatly influence this process. An optimistic person is going to do this differently than a pessimistic person framework. In that regard, what I might do is I might start smaller. I might encourage them to say, let's break down this week, right? Let's think about what we're going to do this week. As an example, when we did the stick shift example and I had that graph with all the sub-goals, you guys remember that? The problem is that we could set a goal, a desirable goal, but that first step is so overwhelming that the whole process seems impossible. Okay? If I can't get through that first step, the rest of it just doesn't matter. So if you're thinking about working with somebody who is apathetic, that's the framework they're going to be looking at this. And so what we actually do is we take that first step, right? So let me give you an example. Working with somebody in this context, working with reunification, a father trying to reunify with their child. First step was they had to get clean. And that first step was so overwhelming that just couldn't see themselves getting forward. So what we did was we took that first step and we made it the goal. Getting clean now is the goal. Now let's work backwards from that. And for lower hope individuals, that's what we have to do. We just have to break it down to where what I do today is contributing to what I want to achieve. Yeah. Question 3 and 4 is focused on building willpower. All I'm doing is in that goal setting process, I'm just doing willpower work. I'm trying to get that agency or that energy up towards that. And then we go to step 5, which is to list the pathways. And the pathways can be kind of broad statements like finishing school might be a pathway. It doesn't have to be necessarily a lot of detail at that point. But once they identify some of those pathways, then we want to do the barriers work. We want to make this realistic because we want to help them identify viable pathways to their goals. Now, what happens to willpower if we spend a significant amount of time talking about barriers? It's going to take a nosedive. And so right away, item 7 is about building that willpower right back up. And very intentionally, not just like a movie, but a time when they've overcome something difficult, right? So it's reminding them that they can do this. Now, the other thing is, if a person is kind of apathetic or not putting a lot of energy because it's just overwhelming to them, you can also break this down and say, well, let's talk about areas of your life that are going well. So right now we're doing hope work in its broadest perspective. But what we can do is also look at hope for my friends, hope for, let's say I'm a student athlete, hope for those, start identifying the domains that are important to them, identifying where they've achieved something really hard and good in a specific domain, and then extrapolate that success over to another area. All I'm really trying to do is remind them that they have succeeded in difficult circumstances before. Question 9 is probably the more important piece. And again, this is where we start to break the pathway down into its sub-steps. And again, you can actually use more bubbles or fewer bubbles. Now, if we had time to have you all go through this, what I've learned is that you guys everybody who attends my workshop are bizarre in the way you think, because you actually have the capacity to go from left to right, left to right. And for me, I work from the goal backwards, right? It's easier for me to say, okay, if I want to achieve this goal, what has to immediately happen before that? So let me give you an example. One of my colleagues' daughter at the 10th grade was in real struggle with her parents, wanted to drop out of high school and move to New York. She was in local theater, very talented in local theater, getting a lot of feedback that she was talented, so it's time to drop out of school and move to New York and get on Broadway. Now, getting on Broadway, reasonable goal. It's actually a great goal. Dropping out of high school, not so much a great goal. Or from her perspective, a pathway, right? Her perspective was a pathway. So then and this is all retrospect and influenced how I created this piece, is it was resolved by thinking, okay, if you want to move to Broadway or be on Broadway, what do you have to do? You have to live in New York. In order to live in New York, what do you have to have? An apartment. In order to have an apartment, you have to have money. In order to have money, you have to have in order to have a job, you have to have in order to have an education, you have to, and pretty soon school became a pathway for the child's goal, as opposed to dropping out of school as a pathway to the child's goal. And it's unifying us that your goal matters. Your goal is a reasonable goal, and we can work towards that together. I think it's the same process in working with the child who's going to be an NBA basketball player. Because what we've learned, not just our research, but the other positive psych folks, is the very process of actively pursuing your goals, a lot of good starts to come with that. You start to experience other strengths like courage, right? And the hope begets hope piece starts to come into play, because what happens with all of us is we have the capacity to re-goal. Pretty soon, we realize that being a baseball player at Northwestern's not in the cards for me. But ultimately, I'm a college professor at a university now. I re-goaled and it turned out well for me personally. Not at first, but later. So when I work with students, I'm actually pretty popular when it comes to working with doctoral students, because I don't have a long theoretical conversation about hope and the meaning of life and those kinds of things. My very first question is, when do you want to graduate? Right? Because the best dissertation's a finished one. Right? If you want to graduate in May, when do you need to defend? If you need to defend, when do you have to have a reading copy? If you have a reading copy, when do you have to have data analysis done? In order to have data analysis, I work it backwards so that when a student walks out of my office, they've got a game plan for the next 2 years of their life with dates. And it's that detailed. Dates they have due dates from that point forward. Okay? So it's really just breaking down the steps. So we're in our final few minutes of this. My apologies for not letting you go through this. It actually finishes that. We're actually creating a worksheet right now that is much more detailed pathways work. But I guess I would ask in our final few minutes, are there any comments, reactions, questions? I'll certainly stick around for a few minutes. But.
You talked about how you're testing your hope. What is that? How do you do that?
Testing hope?
Yeah.
You mean like getting people's hope scores?
Hope scores, yes.
Yeah. So I don't think I sent you the measures. I will do that before I leave. The Children's Hope Scale, and I've got it in both Spanish and English translated. Oh, yeah, trust me. We actually are working. We're working on multiple translations of that. Well, in Tulsa, we have a huge Burmese population, Russian and others. It's a 6-item self-report measure, validated for 7-year-olds to 17. We've created a behavioral observation measure of hope, where you look at somebody trained can make an observation about the hope of the child to the goal.
It has to be somebody that's trained.
No, basically it's just goals, pathway, and agency. But we actually work with our child maltreatment team, who stands in the court, who created the instrument. So I feel pretty good about it. The adult one is 8 items, and it breaks down both pathways and agency, so it's not just hope overall. Well, first of all, It is so wonderful to be back in Northwest Oklahoma, and God's country. It's so beautiful out here. When I was in high school, it wasn't so pretty, but it is now. I kind of thank you for the work that you do and for letting me come and spend a couple hours with you.
Well, Dr. Hellman, we appreciate your time and your information today. I'm going to ask Polly and Shannon to come up here as well. Dr. Hellman, I want to present you with one of our district coins. It has our EPS logo on one side, and then we choose a different theme each year. And this year it happens to be Together We Are Stronger, and has a triangle on there with administration and teachers and support staff. So I want to present you, this generally goes to folks that are doing great things in our district, and people that are doing great things as our guests. And so we want to present you with a district coin today, and I want to also present Shannon and Polly with one of those. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. And certainly appreciate these two ladies putting this thing together and organizing it. So I'm going to turn it over to Polly to close us out.
Thank you very much. I particularly thank Dr. Floyd, Doug, and Randy for their tremendous support. And when Shannon and I had this idea to say, run with it, and I said, are you sure? And they said, yeah, go. So thank you all for your support and helping us to achieve a day like today. Please be sure that you have registered so that we have your email and contact information for future work that we do with Dr. Hellman. If you need a book, please get one. I think most of you have my email. If you're wanting PowerPoints or additional materials, just email me, PEMaxwell@enidk12.org, and we will help get you what you need. Thank you very much for your participation. The most important thing for me is for you to go out and make this happen and share this with 2 other people, so that we begin to multiply our efforts and can really help children. That's what we're here for. Thank you.